The office carried the faint sting of burnt coffee and the dry rustle of paper, a scent that seeped into Emily's navy blazer as she lingered by her cubicle. At 20, she was the newest hire in the firm, a Chicago high-rise where the air thrummed with printers and the steady tap of keyboards. Her dark hair slipped from its loose bun, strands brushing her neck as she glanced at the clock. 3:47 p.m. Her hazel eyes narrowed on a stack of unfiled reports, but her fingers, nails chipped from nervous habit, drummed against the desk, restless. She wasn't thinking about work. She was thinking about James. He had no right to be here, not in the middle of her shift. But there he was, slouched in the guest chair beside her desk, his lean frame draped in a faded hoodie, blonde hair mussed from the wind tearing through the loop. James, her stepbrother since their parents' jagged union 6 years ago, was a constant snag in her life. Too near, too bold, too alive. At 22, he carried himself like the city bent to his will, sketching logos for clients in his chaotic apartment, a few blocks off Michigan Avenue. He'd swung by with some flimsy excuse. "Need a stapler," he'd said, that crooked grin flashing. But the way his knee nudged hers beneath the desk spoke louder than words. You're gonna get canned if you keep staring at me like that," he said, his voice a low scrape, the kind that tightened her chest. She swatted his arm, her gaze flicking toward the glass-walled office where John, her boss, hunched over a ledger. The old man was a fixture, gray hair thinning to wisps, shoulders curved from decades of barking orders, his raspy voice a permanent growl about deadlines. He'd already pinned her with that sour look twice this week for late filings. She couldn't afford his temper today. "Then quit distracting me," she shot back, but her lips betrayed her, curling upward. She slid a report across the desk, pretending to focus. But James leaned closer, his breath grazing her ear, warm, faintly sharp with mint. The air shifted, heavy with something she couldn't dodge, and then his hand found hers, rough from pencil stubs and late nights, fingers threading through hers with quiet intent. Her pulse kicked up, a frantic rhythm she couldn't hush. It happened too fast to stop. One moment she was shoving the report aside. The next, his lips were on hers, fierce and known, tasting of mint and the cigarette he'd smoked on the way over. The cubicle's gray walls blurred into a mess of pinned memos and faded fabric as she pressed into him, her hands clutching his hoodie, the world shrinking to the heat of his mouth. The office noise, phones, printers, distant chatter, faded to a dull hum, drowned by the rush in her ears. His fingers tightened on her wrist, pulling her closer, and she let him, the edge of the desk digging into her hip. A rough cough sliced through the haze. "Emily?" John's voice rumbled, thick with years of smoke and impatience. Panic flared, hot and sharp. She tore away, her heart slamming against her ribs, and dropped to the floor, scrambling under the desk. The carpet scraped her knees through her tights, coarse and unforgiving, and she curled into the cramped space, her breath jagged. James froze, his boots planted by the chair, his shadow stretching long across the floor. She pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling the sound, the echo of his kiss still warm on her lips as John's heavy steps shuffled into the cubicle. "You again, James?" John grunted, suspicion curling in his tone. Through the desk's narrow gap, Emily glimpsed his scuffed loafers, the frayed cuffs of his slacks brushing the floor. His gnarled hand rested on her chair, knuckles knotted with age. "Just dropping off some proofs," James said, smooth as glass, nudging a crumpled sketch from his pocket onto the desk. Emily's stomach twisted, her thighs aching from the awkward angle. The faint tang of John's aftershave, cheap, woody, too strong, drifted down, mixing with the dust beneath the desk. "Tell that sister of yours these reports were due at 3. I ain't running a playground." His words hit like gravel, and then he turned, his cough trailing as he shuffled toward the break room. Emily held still, counting the fading thuds of his steps, her chest burning until the silence settled, thick and expectant. She crawled out, knees trembling, and met James's gaze. His eyes dark, glinting with something reckless, a dare she couldn't ignore. "Too close," he muttered, but his hand was already on her wrist, pulling her to her feet. The desk creaked as he tugged her against it, her back pressing into the edge. papers sliding beneath her weight. Her breath hitched, not from fear now, but from the fire sparking back to life. Em, he rasped, voice rough with want, and then his lips crashed into hers again, hungrier this time, unyielding. She didn't pull back. The table groaned as he lifted her onto it, her legs curling around him instinctively, the reports crumpling beneath her. Her hands slid under his hoodie, finding the warmth of his skin. And the office, the clocks, the rules, John's shadow, slipped away. There was only James, the press of his body, the desk's hard edge, and the wild, reckless pull she couldn't fight. Her hands roamed under his hoodie, tracing the heat of his skin. Taut, alive, marked by faint ridges from old scars she'd memorized years ago. The office dissolved around her. The relentless tick of the wall clock, the rigid lines of cubicle walls, John's lingering shadow, all swallowed by the pull of James. Her fingers dug into his back, anchoring her to the moment, the desk's edge biting into her thighs through her tights. His breath came fast against her neck, uneven, carrying the faint bite of smoke and something sweeter, a trace of him that clung to her senses. She tilted her head, catching his lips again, the kiss messy now, urgent, like they were racing against some unspoken deadline. The air in the high-rise felt charged, the hum of machinery a distant pulse beneath the roar in her ears. Her blazer bunched at her elbows, the fabric rough against her arms, as she pulled him nearer, the warmth of his chest bleeding through his hoodie into her. James's hands slid to her waist, firm but unsteady, like he was fighting to keep control. The desk rocked slightly, a sharp creak cutting through the haze, and for a fleeting second, Emily's mind jolted. John could come back, his cough echoing down the hall, his weathered face twisting in disgust. But the thought evaporated as James murmured her name, low and ragged, his voice threading through her like a current. Her pulse hammered, a wild drumbeat against her ribs, and she pressed herself closer, the risk only fanning the heat coiling inside her. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting jagged shadows across the cubicle. Over the scattered pens, the toppled stapler, the floor where she'd crouched moments ago. Those shadows stretched long and thin, pooling around them like ink, a silent witness to the line they'd crossed. She could still feel the carpet's rough scrape on her knees, the tight knot of panic when John's loafers had loomed near, but now it fueled her, turned the fear into something sharp and alive. Her fingers curled into James's hair, tugging gently, and he responded with a sound deep in his throat, raw and unguarded. The city pulsed beyond the windows, cars honking faintly, the wind rattling glass panes 20 stories up. But in here, time bent, stretched thin by the weight of their tangled breaths. Emily's tights snagged on a desk corner, the faint tear a quiet snap in the stillness, and she didn't care. Her legs shifted, drawing him in, the table's surface cool against her skin where her skirt had ridden up. His hands moved higher, brushing the curve of her hips, and her chest tightened, not with doubt, but with the dizzying rush of wanting more. Then a sound pierced the fog, a low metallic clank from the hall. Emily froze, her lips still brushing his, her body tensing. James pulled back just enough to meet her eyes, his gaze dark, searching. The clank came again, closer, joined by the shuffle of steps. Not John's heavy tread, but something lighter, sharper. Her heart lurched, a fresh wave of adrenaline flooding her veins. "Someone's coming," she whispered, voice barely a thread, her hands dropping to the desk's edge. James didn't move, his grip on her waist steady, his jaw tight. "Let 'em," he muttered, defiance flickering in his tone, but she could see the shift in his eyes, wary, calculating. The steps grew louder, a rhythmic tap against tile, and Emily's mind raced. The break room was down that way. Maybe John had circled back, or someone else had noticed the empty cubicle. Her blazer sleeve caught on a paper clip as she twisted, scanning the shadows for an escape that wasn't there. "I am. Relax," James said, his voice a low anchor. But she shoved at his chest, sliding off the desk. Her feet hit the carpet, unsteady, the reports fluttering to the floor like shed skin. She smoothed her skirt, her hands trembling, the heat of him still clinging to her as she ducked behind the cubicle wall. James straightened, raking a hand through his hair, his hoodie askew, but he stayed put, leaning against the desk with a casualness that didn't match the tension in his frame. The steps paused, then shifted, fading toward the copy room instead. Emily exhaled, her breath shaky, the tightness in her chest easing but not gone. She stepped back into view, meeting James's eyes again. He tilted his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, but it didn't reach his gaze. "You're jumpy," he said, softer now, stepping closer. His hand brushed her arm, a quiet question in the touch. She didn't answer, just leaned into him, her forehead resting against his shoulder. The office settled back into its hum, but the shadows felt heavier now, pressing in. They'd dodged it, this time, but the pull between them hadn't faded. It simmered, waiting, as relentless as the city outside.